Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest Work Foundation event, looking at the changing state of the UK labour market, where today we're going to be looking at the implications of the ONS data published this morning, alongside a host of new policy announcements and developments, really to try and get under the skin of the question, what can we expect to see happen in the world of work, jobs and the economy during the remainder of this year, but also across the remainder of the Parliament. My name's Ben Harrison, and I'm the director here at the Work Foundation, which is a policy think tank that sits within the Management School at Lancaster University. We at the Work Foundation are committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market, as well as the interrelationship between health and work. And of course, those issues couldn't be more relevant. Such a big focus remains on the state of the UK labour market, the issue of economic inactivity and ill health. And we're gathered here today in the middle of a hugely important and busy couple of weeks on these issues. This week alone, we've seen major announcements from the government on how it intends to reform welfare. Earlier today, of course, we have had that latest data from ONS on the state of the labour market, but we've also had news from the Bank of England that they are holding interest rates steady, and Sir Charlie Mayfield has published his initial report in his Keep Britain Working review. Next week, of course, we're going to be hearing from the Chancellor as she gives her spring statement. And although initially that had been slated as being a more low-key and more routine update on the state of the UK economy and public finances, it now looks set to contain some really significant announcements on further public spending cuts and what we can expect to see in the longer-term spending review. All of which leaves us with an awful lot to talk about today, and a big question really, that with so much policy change on the horizon, what are the prospects for the labour market in 2025, and what do we see as some of the biggest challenges and risks that might lie ahead? And to help discuss that, and I'm sure lots more, I'm delighted to be joined today with a fantastic panel of contributors, including Nicola Smith, Director of Policy at the TUC, Martin Weale, Professor of Economics at King's Business School and former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, and Michael Stull, Managing Director at ManpowerGroup UK. Before we hear from each of our contributors today, I do just want to set the scene a little bit on the latest data that we got this morning from the ONS. So if we can pull up the slides now, please, I'll just talk you through some of the headline statistics. So the employment rate is at 75%. That's up on the quarter and slightly up on a year ago. Unemployment is also up on the quarter and on a year ago and sits at around 4.4%. I think it is worth just repeating, and we're doing this on a regular basis now, some of the caveats around that data. ONS themselves issues something of a health warning around the data due to the robustness of the surveys that underpin it. But nevertheless, those numbers do represent something of a pretty consistent picture from the LFS over the course of a number of months and quarters now. Vacancies have continued to decrease. They're now down to 816,000, and that decline does appear to be slowing overall, although it'll be interesting to just unpick some of those figures with our contributors today. They're roughly back to where they were pre-pandemic. And then finally, economic inactivity due to long-term sickness continues to sit around 2.8 million, with around 676,000 of those individuals stating that they would like to return to work. So clearly still a massive issue, and one that the government's been trying to get to grips with this week. Next slide, please. On pay, regular pay growth has risen to 5.9% on the year, while nominal pay growth has now been above 4% for 3 years. That represents the strongest run of pay growth since records began in 2001. But of course, again, it's worth putting those numbers into a little bit of historical context. Prior to the most recent period, wage growth had largely stagnated since the Great Recession in 2008. We can move on to the next slide now, please. And so then finally, while unemployment is historically low, there are growing concerns, I think, around youth unemployment in particular. We see 106,000 more young people aged between 18 and 24 unemployed than they were a year ago. And separate data from the ONS that was released in February showed that just under 1 million young people now between the ages of 16 and 24 were not in education, employment or training. And that's the highest level of NEETs that we've seen for more than 10 years now. So that just provides some of the kind of key headline figures that we're seeing on the labour market to provide us with a little bit of context. To get us going in the wider conversation, and I'd now like to bring in Martin Weale to provide your perspective on the latest data in the labour market and the economic picture as a whole. And just to say to everyone who is dialing into the call, if you would like to raise a question or a reflection for our speakers, please do so through the questions function, and I'll look to bring in as many of those as I can through the course of the open conversation. But for now, though, I'll hand over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to join this panel. I suppose the dominant feature that I saw in the labour market, and that's perhaps not surprising given my background, was what was happening to wage growth. And wage growth of 6% per annum is quite incompatible with the government, with the MPC's target rate of inflation of 2% per annum. To equate them, you would need productivity growth of 4% or so, 4% per annum, and we're actually feeling pleased about any productivity growth we can get. So that's an indicator which suggests that notwithstanding the loosening of the labour market, in some respects at least, things are still pretty tight. And the MPC is paying quite a lot of attention to that. They said that they would be watching carefully what was happening to wage growth and its position relative to the sustainability of inflation close to target. As it is, I think we have a problem there that may resolve, it may not. It is perfectly fair to mention that there are other indicators of wage growth which aren't as buoyant as average weekly earnings, but average weekly earnings in many ways should be the best statistic. It's based on a survey of firms asking them about their wage bill and their numbers employed, a monthly survey that goes to about 9,000 firms or so. And so that's the best information as far as I can see you can get on wages. On the other hand, the bank does make the point that there are some volatile sectors, and if you trim out the volatile sectors, you do get something more in line with some of the other surveys that they discuss. But at the moment, I think you have to be optimistic to believe that wage growth is going to come down, fast enough to justify, an easing of monetary policy in the next few months. Obviously, this isn't good news because the economy is also stagnating. Perhaps one obvious point that I would nevertheless like to make is that stagnation is more likely when you have very low underlying productivity than when you have 2% productivity growth. Productivity growth provides a lift to the economy, and when it's not there, stagnation is much more likely. So in that sense, what we're seeing is almost something of a new normal. 0 is the new 2 in terms of underlying economic growth. What are the prospects for growth in the economy? Well, when people tell me that this or that cure is needed to promote economic growth, I always remind myself of what one of my lecturers said 50 years ago when I was an undergraduate. He said that over the last 100 years, lots of policies have been tried to promote economic growth in Britain, and none of them have worked. Broadly speaking, if you change the 100 to 150, I think that's still true. We still have a problem of having a low level of output and productivity, not only relative to the United States, but also relative to some of our immediate neighbours. And it's not clear to me that that's going to change. Of course, in terms of the budgetary position. This makes things rather awkward. With a growing economy, you get growing tax revenue and you can pay for growing government expenditure. With a stagnant economy, you can't pay for it out of economic growth. So you either have to have less government spending or you have to have tax increases. Why not, you might say, borrow? Well, the trouble with borrowing when interest rates are where they are is that the interest payments build up rather rapidly, and taxpayers may object to paying tax just to pay the interest on the national debt. So the economic constellation isn't pointing very favorably in terms of borrowing increasing borrowing as a way out of the constraints that the government faces. No, to my mind, the prospects are gloomy, and I can't see any immediate recovery from that. So perhaps now I should pass on to the next speaker before I spread even more gloom.
Thank you very much, Martin. You very, very eloquently set out a range of very significant challenges, and we'll hopefully try and dissect some of those as we go through the conversation this afternoon. Nicola, I'd like to turn to you now to follow on from Martin and take us through your reflections on both the economy and the labour market.
Thanks, Ben, and hopefully I can be a little bit more positive than Martin, although there's lots to debate and to discuss there. So starting from today's labour market data, yes, I think I agree the jobs market is in quite a precarious place, but I think we need to recognise the importance of boosting demand in that context. And, we would have liked to see the bank go further today and to cut rates more. And we hope that they will be moving more rapidly towards cutting rates across the rest of the year. We're behind the European Central Bank, we're behind the US, and the cost of borrowing is clearly having a downward impact on growth at the moment. And, the bank acknowledge as much. They recognise the policy is restrictive. On Martin's point as to whether or not this is necessary to prevent inflation becoming embedded across the economy, I mean, my view is that rates are too high, and that when you look at what is happening with settlement data, it is, as Martin alluded to, tracking some way below average weekly earnings. And I think, and I'm interested in what people on the call might know about this, that there is also more we need to be aware of in terms of the composition of the average weekly earnings measure. That's a measure that takes account, as colleagues will know, of the full cost of employing somebody across the economy. But of course, if a lot of lower wage workers are losing their jobs, and if higher wage workers are being kept in employment, then the composition of the AWE will be having some effect on trends in total pay bills, which I think we might need to take into account. And of course, on those productivity figures, we are still a little bit stuck with some of the challenges that Ben was setting out in terms of the LFS and how accurate we think the employment rates that are feeding into those calculations are. So I recognise absolutely concerns about embedded inflation. Nobody wants to see the economy facing those sorts of challenges. But on the other hand, we've had over the last 2 years some of the highest rates of inflation in recent memory, and at no point did we see domestic inflationary pressures becoming strongly embedded in our economic prospects. So, from our perspective, the big challenge that we're facing is low consumer confidence, people having experienced that very strong living standard squeeze over recent years, pay packets going nowhere near as far as they used to. And although we've had, a period now of real wage growth, most people's experience across the economy is that they are much poorer, and that they are worse off. And no wonder, in a context in which living standards haven't grown for a decade, people are still feeling very much that way. So, we would like to see the sorts of measures that will enable more secure jobs and stronger pay growth to give us back the consumer confidence and the demand that we think we need. But, I want to be a little bit optimistic about what's possible. If you look at some other advanced economies, Spain, there's been a very high growth rate there recently. And what has that involved? Both, a boost to domestic spending from government, also new legislation to counter the scale of insecure work across that economy. And I think there's, an opportunity here now, and maybe we'll come on to talk about this more during the rest of the conversation, to really think about, what are the building blocks that the government has a chance to put in place to make sure that, good quality public services, secure jobs, and decent quality employment support are working hand in hand to get us to a position where we are able to both see a higher employment rate and see more people in the sorts of secure jobs that we know are necessary to underpin strong growth. So I think there are many grounds for optimism in terms of where we have potential to get to. It's going to take some change. It's going to take some challenge to established models of the past. I think the evidence is there that it would take us to a place where we have got more of those better quality secure jobs that we think a strong economy is built on. I've got loads more I could say, but I think I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Nicola. And now I'd like to turn to Michael Stull from ManpowerGroup UK. Michael, before we hopped on the call, you sort of reflected that you weren't sure you'd ever seen a labour market quite like this before. So I'd be fascinated to get your reflections on the picture as you see it, and then we'll open up into a wider conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, Ben, and certainly following both Nicola and Martin is a tall order, and I'm not sure that I'm going to bring too much more cheer than they brought. But yeah, and I would probably say a couple of things. One is I do take the numbers with a pinch of salt. I'm not really confident that that the survey is getting the full view of what the labor market looks like. The things that we know and that we see from our side is that hiring is down. Hiring is down about 30%. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that are causing that. This is typically a type of hiring market that is associated with a recession. We're not in recession now, but we see these hiring levels as if there was a big event and that we are in a big downward cycle. And so we know that hiring is down, performing really poorly. We also know that there's still skill shortages out there. We know that the majority of employers are still saying they can't find the skills that they need. And so in many ways, this is a dislocated market. Again, this is something that we haven't really seen is skill shortages in the time of such dropping in hiring. There's, I think, a whole bunch of different headwinds that will play into this, but I think the other thing, and I know Martin is much more versed in this than I am, but the other thing that is really fascinating with this market that we haven't seen before is the wage growth. Wage growth at this level, really, we don't see it. We don't see it in job postings. We don't see it in employers and their expectations of increasing salaries coming up as we enter a new budget cycle. So again, like this is something that we haven't seen. We haven't seen such low hiring and such high wage inflation. And so, we are quite frankly operating in territories that we're pretty uncertain about. I think there's a couple of things that are causing this. Certainly, we know and has been talked around on the, just the broader economic conditions. There's a lack of growth. There's significant uncertainty in the markets, the tariffs, the geopolitical. There's a whole bunch of different economic headwinds that are coming into the hiring intent and pushing it down. You're also seeing the labor costs go up, certainly in the wage growth, but you also have the living wage coming up. You have the increases in national insurance, and all of those hitting employers has force them to make some pretty tough decisions around, you're going to raise your prices, you're going to hire less. How are you going to drive this this increased cost throughout your business? The majority of organizations have reduced hiring as kind of their first action. Now, and I know Martin brought this up a fair amount around productivity. Productivity is the answer out of it. But we can see in the investment numbers, the business investment numbers are down. We continue to see very low IT spend. That IT spend is where you can start to drive some of that productivity numbers. I would say another kind of component of this is the transformation of work. AI has come in pretty fast. I think what it's done to IT, as an example, is very interesting. What it's done to service sector is very interesting, where you need a third, 2/3 less of people to get the work done. That is starting to come in to play, and that is starting to chip away at some of the demand that is out there. It is going after certainly the entry-level jobs where it comes to automation. You're seeing it within the knowledge workers, especially into the entry level in the knowledge workers, and you're even starting to see that impact the levels of management, because you can get by with less management as well. And I would say the other kind of component here is candidates are not moving. They're holding tight. They're holding on to their jobs. They experienced in COVID that the last one in was the first one out, and so they're not wanting to take the chance. And so that's also creating a lot less opportunities for people. And so you're seeing this come through into the hiring intent, which doesn't necessarily play out in the numbers that we have seen. So fascinating market. I'm sure we'll get into some of the opportunities that we might have to solve it, but it's very complex, and there's a lot of trade-offs. And I do agree with or kind of echo some of Martin's words. Is your best opportunity out of this is to find productivity. And so that is always the saving grace when you're in this stagnating type of market.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. If I can just invite all of our contributors now to turn their cameras back on, and we'll get into the more open part of the conversation. And just a reminder to everyone who is watching, you can ask a question of our panelists as we go through the conversation. If you can use the question and answer tab in Zoom for that, that would be great. But in the meantime, to sort of begin our sort of broader conversation, and obviously, I guess we've all heard there to a greater or lesser degree, although Nicola, you sort of had a valiant effort at sort of trying to inject a bit more optimism into the conversation. We are facing a kind of challenging picture, and no doubt that is underpinning some of what we'll hear from the Chancellor, or we expect to hear from the Chancellor next week. But Martin, I thought I might come to you and sort of challenge you a little bit in terms of, given we're sort of nearly 12 months in now to a new government, yes, there are various headwinds kind of coming towards the UK economy, some of which is in the government's gift to do something about, some of which is much more challenging. Where would you identify some of the sort of positive steps or the positive direction of travel that the government is taking, whether it's around its industrial strategy, its focus on skills, and where they may be able to kind of channel more energy to try and boost some of that productivity challenge that you were mentioning?
Well, I suppose despite what I said earlier, if I had to think of a single issue that was constraining Britain's economy, I would say planning rules. Now, that's not going to resolve problems quickly, but if you want to build long-term growth, then it does have to be easier to build. And I mean, there's no doubt that the government recognises that, but progress nevertheless looks as though it's being a bit slow. So that would be one thing. Where I'm more nervous is the sort of enthusiasm the government has adopted for lifting regulations. I mean, the point about regulation is that the regulated businesses complain that they're being stopped from doing things. And of course, that's exactly the point of regulation. We know that financial institutions can lend too much and borrow too much if they're left to their own devices. So we have to stop them from doing that. And they would complain about that, wouldn't they? So although it's always a good idea to review the regulatory framework and decide whether you're making the most of it. In some areas, I have been a bit concerned that the government may be a bit too keen to reduce regulation.
Do you have any sort of specific examples there, Martin, that you're particularly thinking about?
Well, I was thinking in particular of some of the things that Rachel Reeves said before the general election, where she was talking specifically about reducing regulation on the financial sector. Now, of course, you may find that I think the particular issue was lifting the size of banks that had to have their retail side ring fenced, and of course that if banks don't have to have their retail side ring fenced, then they have access to cheap capital, and they like that because they can use the deposits that you and I make that are guaranteed by effectively the government. So that was where I felt particularly nervous. Yes. But in terms of the regulations that are limiting building, the famous example of the Bat Tunnel in the Chilterns, yes, the sooner those change, the better.
Yes, so some trade-offs there around regulation. I'll come both Nicola and to you, Michael, around that border question of growth. But we have had a question in from someone who is watching the conversation. Fiona Weale asks around our sort of general sense, I suppose, on what the impact of all of this is going to have on the number of vacancies in the future, and whether we expect to see that continuing to drop. And Michael, I'll maybe come to you first on that, because you obviously talked about employer confidence quite a bit at the beginning of the session. Do you have a view on whether we are seeing vacancies level off, or I mean, you mentioned sort of 30% down in your remarks?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things in play. I think one thing in play with the vacancy numbers is as we drive more automation and AI, the job postings are overly inflated. And so we do have to keep that in a little bit of mind. So when we go back in time, it's hard to compare. I do believe what I have seen, especially over the last couple of weeks, is a stability in the numbers. And typically, once you hit stability in the numbers, and I know it's just a couple of weeks, but once you hit stability in the numbers, we're usually 2 quarters away from starting to see it go positive again. So that's what I would say is we are seeing the first signs of a stabilizing market, which will then translate into positivity, hopefully in the 2 quarters ahead.
Yeah, that sounds more potentially optimistic, at least in terms of what we may see on that.
That's right.
Yeah. Nicola, I'll come to you both. I suppose any reflections on that sort of wider question around growth and your confidence that the government is sort of heading in the right direction, but also whether you've got any reflections on the kind of vacancy levels as well.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I suppose on growth, what's one of the big productivity challenges we face in the UK? Investment. Probably everyone can agree on this, and we've got a government that has come in making a real commitment both to trying to put measures in place that will enable greater private sector investment, and also, really importantly, introducing a whole range of ways in which public sector investment can be increased and in which it can crowd in more private sector investment. So, measures like the National Wealth Fund, let's not underestimate the impact that could have. The tweaks that were made to the fiscal rules to allow more borrowing to invest, hopefully, let's see next week, we'll see some big announcements taking forward some of the big infrastructure projects that have been stuck for too long and setting us on a path to not lagging the rest of the G7 on investment, but moving on up that ranking. And I think that's important, and that should help. We talked a lot about policy stability. We haven't really talked a lot about the EU. I think the Bank of England made some remarks, or the Bank of England governor rather made some remarks towards the end of last year. There's been analysis published recently showing that, you know, the current trading relationship we have with our closest trading partners is holding back the growth rate. Let's hope there's an opportunity when we get up to 2026 and the TCA renegotiation to get some improvements there that should make things better. And I also think we've got this big problem, long established in the UK, with a very long tail of low productivity firms. And, you know, we're big supporters of the industrial strategy, but also recognise, you know, that is 20% of the economy. So yes, absolutely, we want to channel government investment into the new high innovation, high growth industries to make sure that the sectors that we are most successful in internationally are able to grow. But, you know, we also want to see change across the economy. And when you look at things like the Employment Rights Bill, it's been controversial in some places. There's lots of business criticism, but actually the evidence shows that better treatment at work, higher employment protection can be a productivity driver. Investment is positively correlated with decent treatment at work. People train their staff more, they invest more in retention. And, you know, our employer survey work would bear that out. People think that where there are better rights at work, health, productivity, retention, innovation are higher. And, you know, if you look at some of what Charlie Mayfield has said today in his review, you know, he recognises that countries that have got more regulated labour markets are those that have got the higher employment rates for people with health conditions and disabilities, for example. Now, you know, much as many of us might like to see us move much closer to a European flexicurity model, I completely recognise we're not going to get there overnight. The UK's got real strengths in its jobs market and its labour market and how we operate. But I think we need to be open to learning from those economies that are doing things better than we are. You know, our sick pay rate, for example, does not incentivise people to stay in work. You can get a lot more money out of work on universal credit than you can if you're on an extremely low rate of sick pay. So, you know, incentives that make it more financially viable for people to leave the workplace altogether rather than to stay in work with their employer don't make sense. And, you know, that's the sort of regulation that we should be looking at that's growth enhancing.
Thanks, Nicola. That's really helpful. And Michael, I'd love to come to you next to maybe just get a few reflections on some of the points Nicola has just raised there, really, about this sort of interrelationship between productivity, job quality, routes to progression, because it does strike me that some of the things you were talking about earlier around, you know, some of the automation and the kind of the sort of actual changes in the way in which organizations are structured and what entry-level roles look like in the future, employers are sort of grappling with all of that right now, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think it's we are at a bit of an inflection point in the way and how work gets done. And you know, just I did want to just put one point into. I think one of the things the government could do is just get some clarity and the details in place. Just a very practical. Because as we don't have the details, it's hard to react and to be able to move forward. So that would be one push that I would have on the current government, is to probably move a little bit faster on the details. Now, when it comes to the changing world of work with AI, if you can imagine what's going to happen where your typical entry points into work is going to be automated. It's going to be automated through robotics. It's going to be automated into from AI. And this notion of knowledge is no longer an asset. So your ability to apply knowledge, your ability to have more of the human skills like empathy and service, those are all areas that are going to be growing in terms of need over time. And so when you look at the traditional employment model that we have in place, where, you know, it's a pyramid up into an organization, you're bringing people in, you're investing in them and going up, I'm not certain that's going to exist in the future. And so this notion of more of an up and down organizational structure probably is going to exist. You can see the rise in, and I know Nicola brought up secured work, you see the rise in freelancers and independents. And so I think one of the questions that we'll be asking ourselves is, do we need to rethink around the employment model, how it actually works, what the contract is, and with whom. Because I do think that the traditional career path up through an organization is going to be significantly challenged by automation and AI. And I don't think it's that far away.
Well, so I just want to quickly follow up with you on that, Michael, actually. So part of the stats that I was talking, outlined at the head of the meeting around youth unemployment and sort of concerns that people have, really, that the sort of traditional entry points into work for young people and into the kinds of roles that they can progress through. If we do see some of those entry-level jobs essentially taken out of organizations because they're being automated, the idea that there could be kind of missing rungs on the ladder, essentially, for young people. Are you already seeing some of that in some of the job postings and sort of decisions employers are taking?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see where the employment numbers, you can see where, and you put it up at the beginning around the pressure on youth coming out of the workforce and not being active. So we are starting to see that really start to come into play. And then the question is, and I think one of the norms that we should really be pushing against is our education system. The education system has been built to be able to provide people knowledge, which I'm not so sure has a ton of value anymore, but it's also there to show work ethic. And so our ability to show that you are somebody who is a reliable worker, you have learnability skills, you have interpersonal skills. I think those are things that we need to challenge and think about. Is there a different way? Is there a more productive economic way to get people into work as opposed to the traditional way that we've been doing it through a long, grueling process?
Yes, yeah. Nicola, I'll come back to you on some of that as well just in a moment. And we've also had a question from Mike Hoffman in the chat around the sort of rise of skills-based organizations, as he refers to them. So not getting too hung up on job titles, but thinking about the skills within your organization.
I love this. Is a great topic. This is a very because I think organizations want to be skill-based, but I think the practicality of being skill-based is very different than the desire, the theoretical desire, because you have to get rid of this notion of using experience as your proxy for skills. And that's kind of like a lazy way of doing a job description, is just to put the experience in there, because you don't really often, hiring managers don't really want to think about what are the skills, and they're worried about taking chances on people that maybe don't have direct experience. And I think AI is going to exacerbate this significantly, because, and we have this now, we have AI matching against AI. And when jobs are changing, AI only works when it's looking backwards. And when jobs are changing, how are you matching people? How are you matching with skills? And so our ability to get to a skill-based organization, I think those that get there and understand it are going to have a significant advantage over those that don't. So I would push all employers to be thinking about skill-based and what really are the skills that you need. Like problem solving. Problem solving is a gold, that is worth a significant amount in the marketplace, because if you can solve problems, you can do a lot of things.
Yes, yeah. Martin, I'd like to just give you the opportunity to come back in, because I know you haven't for a little while, and just any reflections on the sort of suite of things that we've been talking about there over the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, the kind of trends around AI automation, issues with it at the bottom end of the labour market, some of the Nicola's reflections around the importance of the Employment Rights Bill.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I mean, first, although I'm not putting words into Michael's mouth, not accusing him of saying something he didn't say, of course, there's the general point that we've had all sorts of automation over the last 200 years, and jobs have changed, but they haven't disappeared.
Absolutely.
No, more people are employed now than for most of Britain's history, despite the automation and despite the repeated concerns that people have had at losing their jobs. So, no, in the short term, there may and probably will be disruption from AI, but I'm confident that the market will evolve new models that do allow people to develop their careers, in perhaps rather different ways, but given working habits, they're something that the market is likely to adapt to rather than the other way round. On the another point that you made earlier about people being reluctant to change jobs. Now, that in itself may be limiting productivity growth, because one of the important routes by which productivity does increase is people changing jobs. What you observe typically, or you used to observe before the epidemic, is that when young people change jobs, they tended to get fairly big pay increases. Pay increases were associated with changing jobs. When old people change jobs, they tended to have pay reductions. And that suggests to me that the job changing by young people is voluntary. The job changing by old people is forced on them, through redundancy or, perhaps declining health, perhaps things like that. But anyway, while people are reluctant to change jobs, then it'll be harder to get productivity growth going. On the point that Nicola made about the measure of average earnings, yes, of course, it's perfectly true that it's an average, but you would need to be substituting low-paid people with high-paid people on a very big scale to get the sort of divergence we're seeing between the rate of wage growth that the average weekly earnings measures and where it needs to be consistent with 2% inflation. So certainly I'd agree with her point, but I don't think it's a very important part of the story. Okay, well, I'll pass now and look forward to coming back in the future.
Thank you, Martin. Nicola, is there anything that you wanted to reflect on from the last few contributions? And then after that, I'll move us into some of the more kind of sector-focused bit of the conversation.
I suppose to pick up on what Michael was talking about in terms of skills, I tend to agree. There's a huge challenge facing the UK economy in terms of supply side problems around skills investment, the availability of appropriate qualifications and routes for young people into those qualifications that equip them to do the jobs that need to be done. And we've seen, I think there's research showing something like a 27% fall in employer investment in skills over the last decade. We invest so much less in this country in skills provision than many other competitor economies. And apprenticeship starts for young people, down something like 7% just on the year. They've fallen off a cliff. So something's gone pretty badly wrong in terms of our skills system, whereby, huge amounts of the apprentice levy seem to be being spent on the highest paid people getting access to master's courses, and young people are coming out of school and finding that there's no decent training opportunities for them to get into the jobs market and to get proper learning and earning opportunities that will equip them with the skills and the experience that they need to progress. So I think there's a really big challenge there to look at. The neat statistics, are young people not in education, employment or training are a real worry. But I also think it's important not to overstate the extent to which this is sort of structural change, technologically driven, reducing permanently the number of routes available to young people, and to look really carefully at what is actually, and I'm sure Michael would acknowledge this and will know this from the work that you're doing, Michael, a really complicated picture of like lots of variation between local labour markets, parts of the country where there's very many jobs, parts where there's very few, real variation in the prospects of young people depending on whether or not they leave school with higher levels of qualifications or not, a sort of growing proportion, but let's not overstate the size of the problem, of young people who are economically inactive because of ill health, where a lack of access to decent healthcare, along with big falls in living standards, is probably a contributory factor. I mean, you can't overlook things like in parts of London, 1 in 10 kids are growing up in temporary accommodation. That has an impact on families and on kids' opportunities and where they're likely to end up. So I think there's an awful lot happening. And at the same time, we've seen the level of employment support available for young people again reduced. You know, what was originally, when it was set up, Job Centre Plus, a sort of an amalgamation of employment support programs and a system for administering social security benefits, has been really residualized. And, you know, we haven't got anything like the levels of support in place at the moment that we used to, for example, when the New Deal for Young People was introduced, you know, many decades ago, or indeed the Future Jobs Fund. So, which was, you know, a job subsidy scheme for young people in labour, in areas of low labour demand. So I don't have all the solutions, but I think that looking at the challenges facing young people trying to move from education into the labour market is a pretty complex area, and it means different things for different young people. You know, and it's as much linked to the design of the curriculum as it is to the availability of apprenticeships, as it is to what's happening in particular local labour markets. But that doesn't mean we can't improve it. We can, and there's evidence from other countries and from previous periods of social policy in the UK of showing that the difference that these sorts of interventions can make. And I suppose on I mean, maybe I should pick this up with you later off the call, Martin, because I am perplexed by what is happening with wages trends in the labour market data at the moment, because I think a bit like Michael said, we don't see the sorts of wage rises coming through that the AWE are suggesting people are getting awarded. I'm not suggesting I've got all the answers to it. I suppose I'm wondering, you know, you're probably right, the scale of the compositional impact doesn't explain the divergence. But when you look at settlement data, which is, you know, the amount that people are getting in negotiations or in regular pay awards, it's tracking some way below the AWE still. And, you know, during a period of sort of weaker labour market growth, you would expect to see, and, you know, today we saw real wages fall in the latest data. You know, that said, I suppose what we could be seeing is, after a period of such sustained falls in living standards, people are trying to get some catch up. And I suppose my question is, how much of a problem is that for the economy? Do we really need to hold people's pay down even more before we can get interest rates down? Is it going to be inflationary if people continue to see their wages rise a little bit higher than 2%, or is it actually going to give us stronger demand? There would be evidence from other countries, I think, that would suggest you can see stronger growth rates without the sorts of inflation risks that the Bank of England are worried about. So, you know, let's see, that would be my preference.
I would very much like to get to the bottom of some of that pay data question as well. Unfortunately, because I'm conscious of time, I'm not sure we're going to get through all of that this afternoon. But it may very well be one we can pick up offline. I do want to just spend the last bit of the conversation this afternoon focusing on a little bit of the kind of issues around ill health and economic inactivity. And in particular, I think some of the sort of findings coming out of the Charlie Mayfield paper this morning, you mentioned it there, Nicola, around the role of employers alongside government in thinking about early intervention, keeping people connected to the labour market when they fall ill, and the extent to which the sort of direction of travel that we're sort of seeing coming together from government feels like it's going to be fit for purpose or not. Clearly, we had some pretty significant welfare announcements this week as well. Michael, I'll maybe come to you first, just in terms of your sense of how employers, and it's very hard to generalize, I know, between large and small and different sectors, but when employers sort of hear a message from someone like Sir Charlie saying, actually, employers are going to need to do more in this space and really sort of be much more proactive in thinking about workforce health. What's your sort of general reflections on that?
Yeah, and I think the data will show you that organizations that provide better jobs, better opportunities, better pay, better benefits, have higher productivity, have higher growth rates. I mean, it all ends up, you know, coming together. And so employers should be focused on thinking of their employees, their workers, as an asset as opposed to a cost. And I think many are focused on the, you know, what is the cost in the quarter, and it's a transaction as opposed to a longer term talent strategy. And so organizations really should be pushing themselves, and I think some of the changes that are being made are going to push organizations in that way to be thinking longer term around what is their strategy, what are the skills they need, how are they going to get those skills through multiple sources, and multiple paths to be able to deliver. And those that do that are the ones that are going to win. And that has shown time and time again is, you get the best people, you're going to do better.
Are there particular sort of issues when sort of thinking about those kinds of policies for smaller organisations, Michael? Because that's what we've certainly heard from employers, that they recognise that there is a sort of responsibility that they have, but either because of capacity constraints or resource issues that they cite, that they're going to, they find that difficult to then think about how they practically engage.
Yeah, and I think that there is probably some merit to that, and I do think that employers working together, and I think to me, it is a community that has to be able to build these skills, and an employer in and of themselves, it's hard, and the smaller you are, the harder it is, has to work in conjunction with government, with educators, being very clear around where we want to go and how we're going to get there is something that I think needs to be laid out. And that's why I go back to some of the details. What is the industrial strategy? And then how does education, how does skill building fit into that? And how are we going to deliver that? I think those are really, really good discussions and debates, and where we need to get aligned as a country to make sure that we deliver it.
And Martin, come to you on this issue around ill health more broadly, and I mean, you've sort of taken a bit of a macro perspective in the conversation today. Where would you sort of rank this sort of idea that the UK has sort of had these rising levels of ill health for some time, actually dating back before the pandemic, in a sense, as being one of those big constraints and kind of factors that are interrupting growth and pose a kind of risk for the future and need to be addressed proactively by government?
Well, I think there is a question I think Michael perhaps alluded to this, or Nicola did, how far the increased reported levels of health are the consequence of the workings of our benefit system, that people on long-term benefits feel they can't try work because they're worried about losing benefits, and given the obstacles governments have put in the way of being a claimant, once you are a claimant, you don't want to give it up. I mean, I think it is quite a striking factor that of the advanced countries, Britain is, as far as I know, the only one that has had this declining labour force participation and associated worsening of health. And you can either say that that's because of factors which are particular to Britain, or you can say that factors influencing health that are particular to Britain, that some people argue is a bit unlikely, or you could say that it's some institutional structure that's making it hard for people who have had spells of poor health to go back to work. I haven't done any work myself on that, but it seems to me something that is worth thinking about. Looking at labour force participation, I was interested to see that among the oldest group, 65 and over, labour force participation now is actually higher than it was before the epidemic. Now, you may say that's because of the rising state pension age, and I can certainly believe that that's a rather important factor, but the number of people 65 and over who are still working, it's about 12% of the total, so it'll only be the more healthy ones who are doing that, but there is quite a clear dichotomy between that and the 50 to 64 age group.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. Nicola, I'll come to you on this subject around sort of health and work in the Mayfield Review. Your general reflections would be very welcome, but I did just want to throw in a sort of finding from recent Work Foundation research, which underlined the importance of flexible working for those who suffer ill health, being able to kind of remain in the workforce. We found that if you had flexible work, access to flexible working when you fall ill, you were 4 times more likely to be able to kind of retain your place in the workforce as opposed to drop out. And that's a key part of the employment rights bill, isn't it? That the government's kind of currently taking through Parliament. So it'd be great to get your reflection on the kind of interaction between these different initiatives and pieces of legislation and how we can make the most of them.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, it's been a week for it, hasn't it? I suppose this is this is another area that I think the complexity and the different trends that are going on need to be recognised. So, you know, I think the IFS published some work last week showing that there is pretty strong evidence that there's been a decline in population health in the UK, and they've looked at different data sources. They've looked at what they call deaths from despair, that they've looked at various medical outcomes, and they've concluded that we have seen a decline in the health of the working age population. But I think alongside that, something Martin referenced, that the part of this conversation that has been missing is, of course, the state pension age has been going up. So a bigger chunk of the working age population is older, and as a result, more likely to be disabled or in ill health. And I think that is one of the big drivers. So it's both a general decline in population health, a rise in the proportion of young people who are economically inactive because they're in ill health. But as I said, really important that it's not overstated. It's about 250,000 young people in that position. Now, that's a real worry, but it's not any means the biggest chunk of the economically inactive population on ill health grounds. That is people who are aged over 50. So, you know, we've got a working age population that's aging, where the health is poorer, and we are doing less well, it would appear, than other countries at keeping the working age population in work. What I don't know is how our working age population compares in size to some of those other countries that we are compared to. And it'd be interesting, for example, to look at the state pension ages and the wider pension benefits that are available in some of those countries, I think, where those comparisons are drawn. But you know, what's the answer to this? Well, you know, we heard lots this week about things that really matter. You know, like you just referenced, Ben, the quality of jobs that are available to people. Of course, if someone has got a health condition that is fluctuating, if they're able to access a flexible job with good sick pay, with proper occupational health support, they're much more likely to stay in it than if they only have access to a highly insecure job where there's no adaptations or reasonable adjustments made and they get no sick pay other than the statutory rate. You know, that sort of stands to reason. At the same time, there are challenges in the design of the benefit system. It can be very, very hard for people who are on health benefits, as I think the Secretary of State recognised this week, to move from being out of work to trying work without fear of losing all of the security of their income. And there can also be, you know, it can be hard for people to see significant gains in their income if the system, the design of universal credit and the work allowances that are within that only allow people to keep a very small proportion of their earnings, or if the earnings that they get don't sufficiently cover the additional costs of moving into work. And if you've got a health condition or a disability, that means you've got higher transport costs, for example, to get yourself to a workplace. So I think there are things that need to be considered there. What I am really worried about is the idea that you address this challenge of, you know, the challenge of the quality of jobs available for people, of the level of flexibility that's available in work, by simply raising the bar so substantially, as the government has stated it intends to do, for qualifying for disability benefits that are available only to those with a health condition, whether or not they are in or out of work. So I don't think the government has got the right answer to the problems that it has rightly identified of both the quality of jobs, the support that is available from health services and wider services to enable people to move into works, and the design of the social security system. But it has put an urgently needed policy focus on the ways our labour market will need to change to enable more people in that position to move into sustainable employment and to get our employment rate up.
Yes, no, absolutely, Nicola. And of course, next week we will hear from the Chancellor. So to bring the kind of conversation to a close, we've got about 60 seconds or thereabouts left. I just wondered whether I could get a quick reflection, no more than sort of 20 to 30 seconds from each of you, as to what you think the sort of big priority should be for Rachel Reeves, or the thing that you would really like to see her announce next week at the budget, which wasn't meant to be a budget, but which now it does appear is something of a budget. Martin, I'll come to you first.
Well, I'd like to see her announce how an increase in defence spending is going to be financed. That seems to me the biggest immediate requirement that we have to face, and it will need paying for.
It's a very good challenge. Michael, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I would love to hear what the details are around the industrial strategy and how we're investing in that.
And Nicola, I'll give you the final word.
I mean, all of that, but also, you know, a plan for continued investment in our public services and our public service workforce, because actually behind a lot of the challenges we've discussed today are the schools, the hospitals, and the wider employment services that, you know, are going to be a really important part of the answer.
Absolutely agree with that. And given the sort of pre-briefing around cuts, clearly that is going to be of sharp focus. I think that then just brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this afternoon. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for their contributions, as well as all of you for attending, and the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together. We've got a busy programme of research and events ahead in 2025. You can find out all of the details of that on our website. But for now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the conversation useful, and thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.